I want to talk to you today about performance in the classroom, which is something that I'm sure a lot of you have a great deal of experience with already. But I'm coming at it from 30 odd years of experience in perhaps a slightly different way. And I want to advocate some particular kinds of techniques and attitudes toward using performance in the classroom. I want to begin by asserting that that I believe the best language in prose and verse is meant to be or capable of being spoken aloud. That we are better thinkers and writers if the language we use is comprehensible upon being heard. And I've come to that after a long time, both as a teacher and a writer. And actually, I think it's important for young writers and young readers to be people who begin to hear a voice in their heads and to respond to the voice in the head as they read. I believe in moving your lips as you read. I believe in playing all the parts if you're reading a novel or some other kind of literature. I believe even in visualizing and acting out the parts of an essay. I believe in physically inhabiting any text to the greatest degree possible as a way of conveying and inhabiting and being with, residing with its meaning. So I came to this in a kind of circuitous way. I was a kid who, as you've heard, grew up in Bellingham, Washington. I went to public schools. I had very good teachers in my public schools in Bellingham. And one of the best was a young drama teacher named Bob Beath. And Bob gave me many great lessons in the classroom and on stage. I acted in plays in high school, but Bob also gave me the lesson of setting my ego aside and being part of a group effort to make something happen as a work of art, so that I was not always cast in plays, and I would be the stage manager, or I would manage music backstage, or I would build sets or work on costumes or makeup or any of that sort of thing. And that kind of training in theater has stood with me as a writer, as a reader, and as a teacher all these years. I then, after college, worked as a manual laborer for many years, went to graduate school in my 30s, got my first teaching job in my mid-30s, and it was at Moorhead State University in Minnesota, and I was part of an English department that was kind of a service department, and in the 2/3 of everything we taught was in an English composition program. A year-long English composition program. We were an English department that believed in using literature as models for the best prose. And so our students read novels and essays, plays, and even in the final term of that year of composition, poetry. So in those days, no one graduated Moorhead State University in Minnesota without taking a poetry class, which is a pretty remarkable thing. And I don't think it's true anymore. But I was glad to be part of that program. The problem is that by that time, in my mid-30s, I was a practicing and publishing poet. I loved poetry and literature. And when you go into a classroom in which it's required of students that they study poetry and literature, one thing you discover is that they don't all love it as much as you do. And in fact, in the poetry term, I sometimes came into that classroom facing students, sometimes with their baseball hats on backwards and their arms folded, who were sitting there basically telling me, there's no way in hell you're going to make me like this stuff. All right? That was very dispiriting to me. It was a really difficult pedagogical problem. And one of the things I had to realize is that I cannot make anyone love anything. People love what they love. You cannot force them to love anything at all. So I developed, out of my own experience, a technique that did not insist on their love, but insisted that they practice something with me. Now, this comes from the fact that I began life as an amateur actor, but it also goes on to the years I spent traveling and living as an independent writer and manual laborer, because I met over the years other writers, Patrick Lee Fermor in Greece, Katerina Angelaki-Rook in Greece, my friend Dana Gioia and other friends who were also writers. And I learned that writers were people like me who often had a lot of literature by heart, who carried literature with them in their bones. When I worked in a garden in upstate New York, I used to recite poems to myself. I would set them to tunes and sing them. I learned about people like the journalist Terry Anderson, who was imprisoned in Lebanon for years, chained to a wall in a dark room, and who kept his spirit alive by reciting poems, Bible verses, songs, anything he had in his head and his heart that could keep his spirit alive. Hitchhiking around the British Isles when I was in my 20s, I could sing and recite poems to entertain myself. And I brought that knowledge and that experience into the classroom. And I said to my students, okay, you do not have to love the poetry I love. You do not have to love the fiction I love, etc. But you do have to memorize and recite 100 lines of it before the end of this term, or you will flunk. So that's a simple requirement. It's a requirement just like the essays, the exams, the discussion and attendance, and all the other things that we do in the classroom. And I'm going to tell you that in the 31 years of college teaching I did, this is probably the single most successful thing I did as a teacher. And there are several reasons for this. One is that the best literature is meant to be spoken aloud, and students need to practice speaking it aloud. They don't come naturally as good speakers and readers of literature. They really have to be given time to practice it, to fumble and try it again, and try it again, and try it again, until they understand what they're saying. They have to be given that time. It's also especially important to note that the art of poetry is an art of memory. Mnemosini, memory in the Greek language, is the mother of the muses. And poetry existed in a culture of memory everywhere on earth before there were books, before there was even widespread writing, before certainly publication as we know it in the modern world. So to understand what poetry is, as opposed to what prose is, memory is one of the greatest teaching tools. It's one of the best ways to know that you are speaking poetry and not something else. It's also obviously true that you can memorize and speak prose. The poet James Wright had pages of Dickens by heart, etc. But it's a very distinctly important part of the art of poetry, that we take it into our hearts, into our bodies, that we're able to move with it, to pace with it, to say it as we're driving a car, to say it to friends over dinner, to say it at funerals and weddings, and all that sort of thing, to ritualize human experience by having language in our hearts and in our minds. So just a couple of basics about using this in the classroom. One is, on day one of the term, your students have to know that this is a requirement. They have to know how many lines they're expected to memorize by the end of the term. Now, some of you may feel fearful about using 100 lines. The poet W.H. Auden demanded 3,000 lines of his students at the University of Michigan. Well, maybe in our world that's a little bit much, but it's worth considering how many lines you think they can tackle. Just 10 lines? All right. 25 lines, 40 lines, 50 lines, whatever you feel you can demand of your students, it will be beneficial to them to have the experience of taking this language in, holding it in their bodies and their hearts, and speaking it more than once in the course of the term. Speaking it aloud, speaking it to each other. So you have to let them know on day one what's required. You have to let them know that they cannot pass the course unless they do this job. I will say that in my many years of practicing this technique in all kinds of literature and writing courses, I occasionally encountered a student who was so nervous about speaking in public, so shy or so tortured in one way or the other, that I allowed that student to recite to me privately in my office, and the other students understood that these things happen and that we have to be able to bend that rule. But I still insisted on their memorizing and reciting lines. I also said, you don't have to do your whole 100 lines in one stroke, in one go. You can recite a comic limerick one day. You can recite a Shel Silverstein poem another day, a Sylvia Plath poem another day, an Anne Sexton poem another day, a Shakespeare sonnet another day, etc. And all I do is record how many lines you've done for that day until you've completed your 100 lines. And every time you recite, we applaud you. We don't have to discuss the poem. I might say a word or two about it, but the issue is that you said the poem, you spoke the poem, and you did it from memory. That's what's at stake in this exercise. That's why it's distinctive and crucial and important to do this thing. I may have run into one or two other problems over the course of the years, one or two other issues. I will say that there are probably about 2 or 3 students in 30 odd years who flunked the course because they had contempt for my exercise and refused to do it. And that's just it. You have to hold firm as you do with your exams and your papers and everything else that you do. So that's one aspect of poetry and performance in the classroom. Another aspect of performance in the classroom is that I may discover in the course of reading, let's say, a novel. Let's say Bleak House by Dickens, which I taught for many years in a literary survey course. I may discover that readers are not seeing the kind of world that Dickens is talking about, that they're reading just to pass a test. They're reading just to accumulate facts that they can reiterate on an exam, the names of characters, plot elements, etc. They're not laughing aloud when they see characters acting certain ways, like the funny way that Inspector Bucket thinks when he's touching his nose like this, right? So one way you can help students who don't have a theater in their heads or a cinema in their heads and who need help reading that in that experiential way is to simply stop the class and turn the classroom into a rehearsal space and just say, all right, you play this character, you play that character, you play this character, you play that character, you play the narrative voice, you read the narrative out loud. And all of you guys, in the course of this passage we're going to perform here, you perform what Dickens's narrator is speaking aloud. And let's visualize it in the room. Let's see the geometry between characters, their interactions, what kind of space they're in, how they see each other or not, or don't see each other, all that sort of thing. So turning the classroom into a rehearsal space is, for me, a really important thing. Now, I'm aware that many people are under enormous pressure as teachers. and pressure to teach toward the exam, the standardized exam or other exams, administrative pressure, social pressure, political pressure, whatever the pressures may be we face as teachers these days. Maybe it's a time pressure. You teach only in 50-minute units or 1-hour units, and you've got to decide how you're going to budget your time yourself, how often you're going to use performance as a teaching technique, and how often you just can't afford to do it. But I recommend doing it. Here's an example. Here's a poem that I've had in my head since I was 16 years old, because I spoke it at forensics tournaments in Washington State, where I was performing oral interpretation to win a state trophy. And it's a poem that, frankly, I did not understand as a 16-year-old. It's a poem that was written by one of the most difficult in many ways and sophisticated of all modern poets, T.S. Eliot, a man who was getting a PhD in philosophy at Harvard when he wrote this poem, although he didn't finish his degree. And certainly this poem is informed by all of that philosophical discourse, which you can find in his dissertation. I was a 16-year-old in Bellingham, Washington. I didn't know that. I responded to this poem because of its tone, its feeling, and its sound, its magic. So I bring this poem into a classroom now in the 21st century. It may be a college classroom, it may be a high school classroom. And I say, let's try an exercise. I want you to listen to this poem as I speak it. And I've never spoken the poem the same way 2 times in a row. Every time I say it differently. I want you to listen to the poem and make a movie in your head as you see the images or hear the images in the poem. Now, what we're talking about now is imagery and sound and tone, as we're talking about the art of poetry, right? And afterwards, we're going to talk about the movie that you made in your own head. What did it look like? What did it sound like? What was its feeling and all that? So here's the poem, Preludes. The winter evening settles down with smells of steaks and passageways. 6 o'clock, the burnt out ends of smoky days. And now a gusty shower wraps the grimy scraps of withered leaves about your feet, and newspapers from vacant lots. The showers beat on broken blinds and chimney pots, and at the corner of the street, a lonely cab horse steams and stamps. And then the lighting of the lamps. The morning comes to consciousness of faint stale smells of beer from the sawdust trampled street with all its muddy feet that press to early coffee stands. With the other masquerades that time resumes, one thinks of all the hands that are raising dingy shades in 1,000 furnished rooms. You tossed a blanket from your bed. You lay upon your back and waited. You dozed and watched the night revealing the 1,000 sordid images of which your soul is constituted. They flickered against the ceiling. And when all the world came back and the light crept up between the shutters and you heard the sparrows in the gutters, you had such a vision of the street as the street hardly understands. Sitting along the bed's edge where you curled the papers from your hair or clasped the yellow soles of feet in the palms of both soiled hands. His soul stretched tight across the skies that fade behind a city block, or trampled by insistent feet at 4 and 5 and 6 o'clock. And short square fingers stuffing pipes, and evening newspapers, and eyes assured of certain certainties, the conscience of a blackened street, impatient to assume the world. I am moved by fancies that are curled around these images and cling. The notion of some infinitely gentle, infinitely suffering thing. Wipe your hand across your mouth and laugh. The worlds revolve like ancient women gathering fuel in vacant lots. Now, sometimes when I'm gutsy enough, I'll have the lights turned out in the classroom and I want them to make the movie in their heads, right? So I bring the lights back up and their eyes are blinking. And then I begin to say, what was your movie like? What did it look like? What did it sound like? What did it feel like? And I begin to elicit responses from students in the room. Very often, they'll describe a movie that felt sad and dark. Some of them will describe a movie that certainly had an urban setting. Some of them, maybe seeing the image of the leaves in a vacant lot and all that, won't see the urban setting, or maybe the horse, the cab horse, will throw them off a little bit. And you just keep eliciting a little bit of detail. One important question is, was your movie in black and white or color? In the 21st century, that's an odd question to ask, because there probably are quite a few students who've never seen a movie in black and white. But some students will make the movie in black and white, and it'll be tonally different. Was your movie slow or fast? What kind of people were in your movie? Well, someone might say, I didn't see any people in the movie. And someone else will say, no, I saw a man in a bed waking up in the morning. And then somebody else will say, well, is it a man? Maybe it's a woman, because you curled the papers from your hair. Is that a woman with curling papers in her hair and clasped the yellow soles? Yellow soles of feet? What does that indicate? Is somebody's kind of dirty, right? Somebody hasn't bathed a lot. Somebody's skin is unhealthy and yellow. And you can elicit much, much more out of that. My point is not that anybody's movie of that poem is correct, right? It's that I want to encourage them to make the movie and to compare their movie to other people's movie. I want to encourage that imaginative response, which is primary, which is fundamental and key to the way Eliot wrote that poem. If I'm talking about meter, I can begin to talk about 4-beat lines and unpatterned rhymes that work their way through the poem. I can use the poem in many, many different ways. And of course, there are lots of other poems you can do the same thing with. Poems in which dramatic voice is being used in different ways and all that sort of thing. It's really, really important that they understand that Eliot wants them to have a feeling. Eliot wants them to make a movie or stage it or move their lips or participate fully in the poem. That a poem is not ever something that you read only with the cerebellum. Ever, ever, ever. A poem is a fundamental human performative experience, a voice speaking across time of human experience. In college classrooms where we're reading sections of Eliot's PhD dissertation along with his poetry, we might then begin to discuss his skepticism about human connection, his belief that we really can't know another person, and that is the belief that underlies other poems of his like The Wasteland and Portrait of a Lady, etc. But that's all secondary stuff. That's all gravy for the graduate school classroom or that sort of environment. The fundamental experience of that poem is tonal, imagistic, human, oral, and all that sort of stuff. So That's another way in which you can use performance in the classroom. I believe teachers should model performance in the classroom. This doesn't mean that you or any of your students have to be great actors. It's really important that you use whatever voice you have. Don't feel that you have to be Ian McKellen, right? Or Helen Mirren when you're speaking poetry. You don't have to be. Use a human voice, be a human being speaking to other human beings, to paraphrase Wordsworth. So here's another example. A poem by Robert Frost. And I might use this as an example of something that's really uncanny in poetry and difficult to talk about. And that is to say, what do you do with a lyric poem that seems to want to capture the way we think, the way the mind moves? I mean, Emily Dickinson is just full of this, right? So much of Emily Dickinson is about the mind at work in the world, the mind apprehending experience that can't really be paraphrased. So we have to be able to talk about that sort of action. So here's a Frost poem I might use in a classroom. It's called Come In. As I came to the edge of the woods, thrush music, hark. Now if it was dusk outside, inside it was dark. Too dark in the woods for a bird by sleight of wing to better its perch for the night, though it still could sing. The last of the light of the sun that had died in the west still lived for one song more in a thrush's breast. Far in the pillared dark, thrush music went, almost like a call to come into the dark and lament. But no, I was out for stars. I would not come in. I meant not even if asked, and I hadn't been. For my money, that's one of the greatest lyric poems in the English language. And it's doing all sorts of complex things that we can begin to elicit from students about outer darkness and light, inner darkness and light, about whether they are different or the same, whether I project my feelings onto the world, whether the world inhabits me in some way or another, whether I will give into some darkness or whether accepting and opening to some darkness is an important thing. There's that bird that moves off into the dark and that he's following that bird. Frost is always following a bird into the woods. There's always that music that he wants to hear, to apprehend. There's so much more you can say about it, but the really important thing for me is that this is a poem that also creates a sense of experience dawning on a person in a moment. As I came to the edge of the woods, what? As I came to the edge of the woods, dash, thrush music, hark. He's just heard it. He's been interrupted by the world. The world has interrupted him and made him hear something. Now, if it was dusk outside, inside it was dark. So we have the inner and outer states that Frost is constantly playing with in his poems. We have human psychology. We have the human mind embodied in the course of the poem. So those are some examples of ways in which performance can be used. Again, I want to encourage you as teachers to be performative. I want to suggest, as I did at the beginning, that this is useful for students as readers and as writers, that they are better writers and thinkers if they know that they are writing to speak something aloud, if they know that those sentences have to convey something to an audience orally and orally. That the best language has a kind of clarity and force that oral performance can help you develop over time. I strongly advocate imitation, imitating the way other people speak, imitating the way other people write, as a way of training the body, training the mind. This is the way musicians learn. Musicians practice the most boring scales forever and forever and forever. This is the way dancers learn, right? Dancers have to stand at the bar doing these gestures over and over and over and over again because they're training the body to perform. They're training the body to be able to adapt and behave spontaneously in the course of whatever it is they're doing. This is the essence of jazz, among other things. It's the essence of improvisation of all kinds. Having that fundamental knowledge, that fundamental ability to reproduce sound, rhythm, and sense in the course of something. I want to make a few recommendations. On the handout that I hope you all have been given, I recommend some old films from the Royal Shakespeare Company, the Playing Shakespeare films, because they are great examples of a theater director who's also a teacher who takes a performance space and turns it into a classroom, just as I advocate taking the classroom and turning it into a performance space. Now, it's really important that you know that you don't have to be able to act like Ian McKellen, the young Ian McKellen, or the young David Suchet, and all those folks in the Royal Shakespeare Company. You don't have to have an English locution, and you don't have to have a trained Shakespearean actor's voice. You can talk like a human being when you're saying poetry. You can even be really goofy. I had a teacher who used to enjoy reciting William Carlos Williams's The Red Wheelbarrow in an Elmer Fudd voice, right? So much depends upon a red wheelbarrow, glazed with rainwater, beside the white chickens, okay? And we would all laugh. And by the way, it's amazing how many of my students over the years have completed their 100 lines of recitation by saying William Carlos Williams, The Red Wheelbarrow. They just had 8 lines left to go, and this was an easy 8 lines to get. Bango, they got it. Okay, so you can do that. I recommend those films. I strongly recommend the National Endowment for the Arts program instituted by our good friend Dana Gioia, called Poetry Out Loud. By now, this program's been going well over a decade, and I think several million American, Puerto Rican, Guamian, etc., students have participated in this program. It's a program in which students are asked to memorize and recite lines of poetry by, or poems by, poets other than themselves. And that's really important. It's important that students understand they're developing their own voice by participating in the language of other people. They're learning something about their own voice, their own ability to move, their own ability to use the whole range of possible performative techniques, whatever they may be. But that is also training in individuality. That participating in the language of other people is part of making us vibrant, alive, vital people. Poetry Out Loud is a great program. I bet a lot of you have already used it. I strongly recommend it. And if you haven't tried it, You can find the website on my handout, and I hope you'll use it. There are also lots and lots and lots now of videos about poetry. There are movies that make use of poetry. If you go to the Poetry Foundation website, you can find a list of hundreds, if not thousands, of films in which poetry is important. And I also want to remind you that this is not just true of teaching literature using performance as a writing technique. It's also true of teaching creative writing. Creative writers are a strange breed in that they often go through a phase when they think everything's about them. And what they really want is to recite their own poetry out loud. And I tell them, well, that's great. That's fantastic. When we give a poetry reading at the end of the term, if you want to perform your poems from memory, do it. And your audience will love you for it. And you will really be applauded for doing this. However, in the course of the term, I want you to memorize and recite 100 lines of somebody else. I want you to have some Shakespeare in your head, or some Sylvia Plath, or some Philip Larkin, or some Richard Wilbur, or whoever the poet may be. It's really important that I not tell students who they are going to memorize. You may have heard people say that memorizing and reciting poems was torture for them in schools because they just hated the poems they had to memorize, right? So I tell students, you find language that you love, that you genuinely love. You get that language in your head and you recite it, all right? The student will come up to me on occasion who wants to recite a rap lyric. If it's a really good rap lyric, I'll okay it. But if it's not good enough, I'm going to say, try something else. Sometimes I've allowed a Bob Dylan lyric if it's a really good one. Not all Dylan is equally good. Dylan did win the Nobel Prize in Literature, so you've got to be aware of this sort of thing. Mostly I discourage song lyrics and expect them to memorize poems that we would call literary artifacts. I think that is the gist of everything I intended to say in my formal lecture, and we're approaching a bit of time in which we can entertain some questions. But I think there's one last point I want to make. As you can see, if you look at the videos from the Poetry Out Loud program, memorizing and performing poetry, or memorizing and performing any literary text, puts you in touch with a human universal, that it is available to all people of every race, gender, and ethnicity on the planet Earth. It is the same for Ukrainians as it is for Russians, as it is for Americans, as it is for Israelis, as it is for Chinese, as it is for Nigerians, etc. It is the human culture of memory. And that culture of memory is endangered by our addiction to technology, our addiction to the mobile phone, among other things. I think we need to fight a sort of guerrilla war against the culture of forgetting, right? Of forgetfulness, and advocate for the culture of memory.